Hi,
Oh,
everybody.
this is so cool.
I'll give you a minute to connect to sound. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1027th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme privilege to be your MC today for a conversation featuring Catherine Lord and Jill Casid. And now I'll introduce Catherine and Jill. Born in Roseau, Dominica, Catherine Lord, Professor Emerita of Studio Art at UC Irvine, is a writer, artist, and curator whose work addresses issues of feminism, cultural politics, and colonialism. In addition to her most recent book, The Effect of Tropical Light on White Men, the subject of today's dialogue, she is the author of The Summer of Her Baldness, a Cancer Improvisation, and the co-author with Richard Meyer of Art and Queer Culture. She has been shown at Site Santa Fe, La Mama Gallery, One National Gay and Lesbian Archives, and elsewhere. She divides her time between Hudson and Manhattan, New York. And our host today, artist, theorist, and historian Jill H. Casid, holds the appointment of Professor of Visual Studies in the Departments of Art History and Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Casid is bringing to completion Doing Things with Being Undone in the Necrocene, the first part of a two-book project on form at the edges of life. Casid is the author of Sewing Empire, Landscape and Colonization, and Scenes of Projection, Recasting the Enlightenment Subject, which is in Spanish as well. Casid is also the author of the co-edited collection Art History in the Wake of the Global Turn. Casid's artwork has been exhibited nationally and internationally, and we are really, really lucky to have Jill as a contributor to the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Jill to get us started.
Oh, thank you. And we have so many, beloveds in the house for what I've been describing as the dream conversation with Catherine Lord. Before we start, I just want to make a personal acknowledgement, basically that I'm the granddaughter of Jewish refugees from Germany and what's now Belarus and Ukraine. My great-grandmother was taken on the first transport of Jews out of the Baden region to the Gorse concentration camp in southern France. As the descendant of dispossessed Jews, many of whom didn't survive, I refuse the weaponization of my grief and losses as fuel for the Israeli state's genocidal war machine, condemn the assaults on academic and journalistic freedom, and the double standards with regard to boycotts and sanctions. And in their names and my own, I'm with Palestine still in not just calling for ceasefire, but also naming to dismantle the genocidal apartheid regime of our time, and doing so as a praxis of love. I'm joining the Brooklyn Rail's NSE and the Zoom room from the unceded occupied territory of the Ho-Chunk Nation, where it's the realization truly of a dream to be in conversation with the force that is artist and writer Catherine Lord, without material consideration of land back, the right of return, reparations, and abolition of the carceral state and colonial occupation. Acknowledgement is, of course, never enough. Let's then not just acknowledge, but also hold open the possible portal that this occasion of our coming together in honor of the publication of this tour de force, The Effect of Tropical Light on White Men, to hold this conversation about abuse, appetite, colonial administration, and ants, botanical colonialism, the commonplace book, Complicity and Cultural Property, Land, Leprosy, the Violence of the Ledger, and the Limits of Legacies, Painting, Paper, Plants, and Putrefaction, Photography, Sunburn, Mirages, and of course, Queer Utopia, Zenith, and Vizami, presents as a chance to send the reverberations of a transversal no to selective solidarity, white supremacy, and Euro-exceptionalism as the channel for a binding bond among the uncounted across the condition of a worldlessness that in my own work I've been calling the necrocene, to bring close a reckoning with the catastrophe that's already occurred. And yet within this worldlessness, a palpable sense that there's still ways of doing things with being undone to insist on the supports for livable life for those rendered disposable. So with that personal acknowledgement, I wanted to start us off by showing this exquisite and also monumentally mammoth PowerPoint that we have of this gorgeous book that brings us together. And this artist book that was over 20 years in the making, The Effect of Tropical Light on White Men, was named by Holland Cotter as one of the best art books of 2023. Cotter in the Times characterizes Lord's blue-bound, pink-tipped beauty as, quote, lengthy, ruminative, non-chronological, and as much about the writer's place of origin, Dominica, as about herself. And he goes on to quickly recount how, Catherine, on your research visit in 2001 to the place of your birth, the island in the Caribbean, Dominica, you were loaned 3 leather-bound ledgers, the quote-unquote commonplace books of Dr. Henry Alfred Nichols, also Lord, I believe, a botanist, physician, and plantation owner on the island from the 1870s until his death in the early 20th century, 1926. Who used these ledgers as a storehouse for quotations from his readings under headings that he invented and that you describe as from abuse to coffee, errors to manners, praise to woman. Cotter writes that you took this scrapbook form of the colonial commonplace book as a model in which you kaleidoscoped a view of your past through anecdotal memory, post-colonial history, and contemporary queer and gender politics. The result, he concludes, is a wry, sharp-eyed, and ultimately moving mix, a late in life grappling with where you came from and where you are now. I've said that Noel Coward's wry, your mordant is frankly devastating, and I mean that as a compliment. But I'd like us to start with how you make an art of constraint by working through the structuring colonial conventions of the commonplace book and the material artifact of the quiet violence of colonial administration that is this form of the bookkeeping ledger book. I love how you describe the refusal of narrative and your friend's concern, where you write, my friends worry about my insistence upon forcing my life through the holes in the colander of Dr. Henry Alfred Nichols. He was a boring man, they say. You're not a boring woman. Make up your own headings. A boring subject, I reply, is a challenge to structure and style. It knocks aside the crutch of narrative. You have to be steady on your feet to make progress, one foot in front of the other. Mind the gap. So I'd really love to start us off with how you perforated that colander of Nichols's commonplace book.
Well, I think part of it would be just introducing the idea of a colander to Nichols's domestic life, where I doubt if there was a colander, he ever saw a colander. Somebody else would have colandered whatever was necessary for him. I did actually find at the Museum of Economic Botany in the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, a lamp that Nichols had submitted to the botanical gardens, which was a calabash, a kind of gourd punched with holes that you could put a candle in. And I think I was thinking about that. But also colanders and patriarchs, they kind of don't go so well together in a sentence. I think, okay, so ways of puncturing that was actually taking this idea of compiling quotations seriously, like a kind of anti-citational work, where there would be other information that would have to do with my own obsessions and other kinds of quotations, and real scholarship that I was pillaging from. I think also a kind of irreverence towards the patriarch. Maybe we should just call him the patriarch. I mean, it took me a long time to learn that he was knighted a few years before he died, and that in the British system of titles, because naturally there's an elaborate system, you would be Sir before Doctor. So he would be Sir Henry Nichols as opposed to Sir Dr. Henry Nichols. But anyway, it's sort of bringing in all this stuff. But I think one of the most important things that I didn't realize until the end of the book, when I was putting it together with Jeff Kaplan, that one of the real imperatives was to, because I always am on the edge about how personal to be and whether to be personal, and whether being personal is something, a sort of female sin in the world of public visibility, like we're too personal. Don't you have anything better to talk about? And in fact, being personal and irreverent and funny and nasty, was a way of eroding and corrupting the purported rationality of something like a commonplace book. I mean, you were watching or seeing the Nichols title, commonplace book headings now, by which he would retrieve the wisdom he'd collected for himself. And they were, when my friend Lennox lent them to me, they were, I just found them insane and fantastically beautiful that anybody on this tiny island would come up with this idea.
Well, even just the color of these, I mean, they already feel as though they're steeped in contact with water or under some kind of strange blue light.
Well, I was photographing them under natural light as the sun was going down. And I just kept those erratic exposures and didn't correct them on purpose.
Which I love. I mean, that feels like a counter light. I was wondering if this is a moment in which you might be willing to give us a taste of the book by reading. I was especially delighted by so many moments, but pages 49 to 50 under auto suggestion.
Sure. Okay, so this entry is auto suggestion, comma, coué, comma, Monsieur Emile. I shall cram myself, my things, my baggage, my shit, my notes on Dominica, my snapshots, my father's photographs, my photographs of other people's photographs, my hip replacement, my chronic depression, the smells of my old age, my prize example of tourist kitsch, my eye for the contours of green leaves, my addiction to bad painting, my gluttony, my lazy sentences, my queer body, my creaky knees, my hot flashes, my light skin. I shall stuff all this into the carapace of Nichols's memory. I will wedge myself and my possessions into a warehouse designed by a man I would have loathed. Nichols broke the ground for his foundation 125 years before I decided to squat in the rubble. And even if I had been alive then, he would never have deigned to consult a female and a lesbian about his plans. Nichols had plantations and servants and 10 children that he owned up to. Things obsess me that Nichols never bothered to think about. Did he look at the color of his hand as he watched it taking notes? Did he look at the color of the hand that placed before him his morning tea? I will not fit. The spectacle will therefore be as traumatic, as humiliating, and as grandiose as if I went to a department store and tried to stuff my 74-year-old body into a bikini. My ass droops, my muscles waste, my belly fat is stubborn. I will engage in the kind of public indecency that might get me arrested. There will be papers bulging from cubby holes. There will be piles on the floor and on the chairs, if chairs there be. Even if I take the warehouse door off its hinges, some packages will be too big to fit. There will be the obligation to dismantle, and then the temptation to leave awkwardly wrapped bundles outside in plain sight on the veranda or just sitting on the ground or under plastic against the rain, wicking up moisture.
Thank you. That sounded so much better read than in my head, but it was so exquisite already. Thank you for that. I am so entranced with how many knots and antis there are here. You speak about this not being narrative, that it's you're squeezing, the over-personal, the sin, the female sin of the over-personal, which is its own negative construction. And yet this is somehow not a memoir. We've talked about this quite deliberately being not art history, and yet, of course, you began with the study of, array of paintings that had not been connected and, little studied. For instance, under the heading of antiseptics, page 38, you write, "Mine are not the sorts of questions with which Olivia would be disposed to help." Olivia is described as one of your unwilling ones who remember, who won't perform the role of native informant. And yet, of course, there's that vignette of you taking her to lunch that tells us so much about what can't be anesthetized, and somehow also about rot, that features so powerfully throughout as one of the strategies. You're using the form of the commonplace book while making clear that my obsessions, you write, are not those of Sir Henry. I'd have made entries for accent, agouti, rodents, AIDS, aloe, art, especially bad, bagasse, boiling lake, brunias, cane, cashew, and I won't read the whole marvelous list. You end with zami in what you won't do, but of course, to name them even under the sign of negation is to allow them to enter. And in the case of the zami, you also do make it one of the last headings, as if you're testing our memory and our attention. By the time we get to Sami, do you remember? I said no. So I would love to have you speak to this aspect of your method that seems particularly delightfully cranky, and if not antisocial, then certainly in my mind very queer.
Maybe us queers are always rather cranky. What else can we be? In a lot of ways, I feel like I put upon myself the most difficult way to do this. I had begun with this idea, and I sort of wrote some proposals and got some money on the basis of it, which said that I would do this mixture of non-existent art, quote unquote, good art, bad art, popular art. I would pick like 10 objects, and through those objects, I would tell the story of this island that not so many people know about or knew about, although, thank you, New York Times, it's been publicizing it. And then that just felt too easy, like it would be all up to me, sort of. I could pick and choose and throw things away and tell bits of the story that I wanted and get rid of other bits of the story. And it felt, I guess, both more and less difficult to take the structure of all these little Nichols headings and see both what I could learn from them genuinely. I mean, I had no reason to learn about wither-tip disease or leaf miner in the lime tree, or coffee blight, or the travails of the clove, or whatever. But I did learn some botanical history, because I just set myself the instruction that when it was possible to find information, I would use that information. I might add other information, but I would use that. And I would try to be truthful, which I suppose is also a good place to say and to confess that sometimes when things got hard or boring, I would just cheat, I would make up headings and put in what I wanted to put in under those headings. And if anybody wanted to do the immense labor of checking my headings against Nicholas's headings, that would be okay too, but so what, in a way. Wow. Ask me it in another way. It's like, okay, let me try and get at it again. It's like trying to make something that looks like an archive, and in some ways is an archive and has the appearance of truth. I mean, it does sort of look like an encyclopedia, and there are illustrations, and there are captions, and there are close-ups, whatever they may mean. Something that had the appearance of truth, but would keep disintegrating in this sort of evanescent reality that you would only get flashes of, and partly because it's a rainforest. I mean, it's things rot. Things molder, they stain, they don't stay around. Other animals eat them. People don't know and they throw them out. People don't care and they throw them out. People burn down libraries, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all this like a constant sort of irritation against the sort of evanescence of what you're dealing with. And the fact that there were like just a lot of ways in which I would go there with one idea about what I was going to do, and for one reason or another that didn't work. You know, ants infected my computer. The fuzzy black lining of my Hasselblad just fell out of the camera. End of shooting that. A hurricane hit, and the copy stand that I was using, the baseboard simply disintegrated into dust and had to be replaced with an exotic hunk of hardwood that happened to be a mango a mango wood, not a mango fruit. It was lying on the ground. I guess maybe it's the crankiness is sort of the moving target aspect, and the fact that it always has been and it always will be. I mean, it's impossible. Was that where you were heading, Jill?
Well, yes, I mean, I think that in such a richly complicated, dense, cranky, and all the aspects of the crank, right? In the sense also of, you know, the doing in a very DIY way with what you're dealt. I think absolutely. But I think I was also even in your answer, right? You bring in another kind of truth under often the heading of what you're not doing, which I think is its own aspect of the critique that I'd love to talk about, which is that you know, there are the citations one might also imagine to be in here. So, you know, Derrida's Archive Fever makes an appearance, you know, as does Benjamin's The Arcades Project. But it's also done, right, to very strategically, not just relocate these, you know, often over-dominant, overweening particular ways of understanding logics, archives, that is its own other strategy that I'd love to talk about. So, you know, under the place marker entry term insanity on page 221, you speak directly of how you're attempting to weave yourself into a history that you must write into being because it concerns a place where archives stand little chance against insects, rain, and indifference. And then the line that I love about the perils awaiting the photographic print. In Dominica, the gelatin that suspends film emulsion attracts a mold that causes the surface to erupt in pimples of oblivion. I wonder if we could therefore, you know, talk about this larger strategy of what happens if we reimagine the archive and history from the place of Dominica. Derrida's own archives, you write, as you know, are not rotting at the bottom of a ravine, but in temperature-controlled facilities at UC Irvine and Princeton. or the example on page 370 to 371, where you set critical responses to your book manuscript next to your note under asphyxia, in which you confront again the problem of using Dr. and white colonial settler Nichols's commonplace book ledgers as your animating constraint, and how you've slithered under his white skin. And this is in magnificent tension with what I would love to just go ahead and read from artist and essayist Lorraine O'Grady, with whom you've been in long-term and important dialogue. And Lorraine O'Grady writes, at the end of the conversation, which closed the catalog of my both and retrospective at the Brooklyn Museum, Catherine Lord and I came to a conclusion that was scary for each of us. After nearly 30 years of secretly supporting each other in our insider-outsider position of immigrant kids, she with roots in the island of Dominica, me with my family from Jamaica, we'd realized that being caught between two cultures was not a place of instability, but a place of strength. In speaking not as just artists of whatever description, but as Caribbean American artists, our voices were added to an ongoing paradigmatic conversation, which was conceivably the most important of the contemporary global world. The effect of tropical light on white men, Lorraine O'Grady goes on to say, Catherine's newest work, with its equal aesthetic and theoretical rigor, its beauty as a physical object, and its fearlessness as settler colonial self-critique. And I want to emphasize that, settler colonial self-critique joins the profound chorus of Jean Rhys, C.L.R. James, and Aimé and Suzanne Césaire, Frantz Fanon and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Lydia Cabrera, Edouard Glissant, Sylvia Wynter, and Stuart Hall, all writers whose work use the Caribbean basin as the source of an innovative archipelagic discourse. So that's a long way of setting up, asking you to speak to how you've approached settler colonial self-critique and what we might call the relocating of European theory, Derrida and Archive Fever, Benjamin from the Arcades Project, to the tropics, where they break down, are exposed to, unavoidable racial capitalism, to climate, to hurricane, contingency, rot, and exposed to your techniques of self-exposure and excoriation.
Well, Lorraine's has been an important conversation and an important friendship in my life, because we are both, we have such eccentric and odd relations to the Caribbean. Lorraine's family comes from an important island in the Caribbean. Jamaica was a big deal, a wealthy island. Big island, much, much richer than Dominica. And I come from this, completely sort of insignificant, hapless island, where, lots of West Indians make fun of Dominica. There's a phrase called typical Dominica, which means, oh yeah, that went wrong too. Or that was really stupid and a Dominican did it. There's that. It's like being, in some ways, the Poles, as in Polish people of the Caribbean, etc. It's like the joke island. So I think there are ways in which Lorraine and I both believe that we don't, each of us doesn't know the other's real Caribbean. There are sort of divisions in that Caribbean. Like, how could you possibly take Dominica seriously? We're looking at this slide now called Araby, which is, I'm just here out here because I see this map and it's so remarkable. This is when the British had gotten Dominica back from the French, and they were engaged in selling land off in Dominica. So they sent out.
Sorry, Catherine, we lost your sound slightly. You're,
Do you still have it or not?
there you go. I think,
Okay.
yeah, you're back. Thank you. Sorry.
All right. This map is from the 1760s, made by an official British surveyor called, I think his name is William Byers. And he was officially commissioned to sell land, to make the map so it would allow to be sold newly gained land in the Caribbean to British people wanting to make a quick buck, and based entirely on lies. I mean, this is a land that shows Dominica to be a flat island with a few little caterpillar-like bumps in the middle. Dominica, the mountains begin at the sea. There is no flat land. So basically, this was a complete fraud. He was selling cliffs and precipices and impassable gullies to people. Anyway, how did I get onto lying and fraud in the Caribbean? I don't know. Okay, Jill, shall I read something else?
But I think that that's actually a perfect response. I mean, if we are, appreciating the ways that you are doing this self-critique, a key aspect of that truth-telling is to also take us to I think some of the limits of exposure too, right? So we're dealing with fraud, but we're also dealing with what is it to, rethink from a place that is not only underestimated and small and misrepresented, but and understood as insignificant, but tiny, volcanic, eruptive, impassable, impossible. And so I think you, as always, answered by demonstration. So thank you. And I would love to, if you're willing, move next to what in a way we've already witnessed, but I'd love to mark it, which is the ways that you work with a particular mode of address. And you write under analgesia that you have an operating assumption. Quote, the reader is Dominican by birth, by invention, or by preference. So page 32. While here, you refuse to accept the unknowing of an ignorance that disappears worlds because we claim not to know them. And you talk about how a curator who was curating your work into a show decided to send or say that you were from the Dominican Republic because they somehow never heard of Dominica, so then it somehow can't exist. You also write in a way to us as if we can hold all that Dominica and this commonplace book hold for you, which, as we've already seen, is almost unholdable, right? That back to that colander, that we can somehow bear a kind of burning candor that also refuses any of our pretenses of empathy, and especially refuses false pieties, that somehow we can and should develop a capacity to bear our complicity while working to undo structures of oppression with an understanding that this isn't work that's, somehow just done by the magic of feeling. You speak in the entry under color blindness, continued, about how you contracted archive fever on a quiz night in which you write about worrying for years about the answer to the question about the number of enslaved persons in Dominica. And you ask the pointed questions of why so slow to see, and then also self-indicting questions of why so slow to see, why did I let myself be soothed? I wonder if we could talk about this strategy of address, of not allowing us to be soothed either. The refusal of an analgesic approach, though of course on this page you do use a kind of radioactive humor, as is often the case. So that entry that I'm just referring to is next to a photograph of a Teletubby. So would you be willing to talk a little bit about candor? And if you like, I wouldn't mind your reading some from Candor Continued, which is on page 99.
I'm so good at this.
Well, I love this book, so.
Well, let me read Color Blindness first. I have to say that the picture of the Teletubby, my girlfriend, lady wife, Kim Thompson, actually went to a Teletubbies summit in the UK, which was held in a secret location. She did movie advertising marketing, and part of the corporate swag was this plastic Teletubby whose head unscrews and that I have long used as a shampoo bottle.
So that's how that happens. Okay.
You
thank
can't
you
just
for
go and
giving
guess it. Anyway, all right, color blindness. Oh, and it's headed with a quote from Monique Wittig. Lesbians are runaways, just like maroon slaves and runaway wives, which is really important to this book. Okay, 1998, I think, or 1999, I am invited out for the evening by Wendy and her boyfriend, a nice Jewish guy from Long Island who fell in love with Dominica. They marry. He will put $60,000 on his credit cards before giving up and going home to the US, blinded by the tropical light. His father has money, a car dealership perhaps. His father misspells Roseau on the wedding invitation. It's quiz night at the Cornerstone, the new cyber cafe equipped with 3 ancient Macs and a few Canadians overlooking the old slave market where vendors now sell carob calabashes and Chinese-made t-shirts. The Cornerstone features a selection of greasy paperbacks and amateur paintings. With the exception of Jeff, once my guide on a hike to the boiling lake. All are white, all couples, all breeders. All plan to get drunk on carob beer, and the grand prize is a 6-pack. The quizmaster is a visiting Australian. What are the names of the Teletubbies? La, Po, Tiddly? Which one is gay? When was the emancipation of the slaves? 1807, 1828, 1836, wrong. 1807, but it was more complicated than that. The trade in bodies was supposed to end in 1807, and all of the enslaved were technically emancipated in 1833. The Apprenticeship Act, however, kept them exactly where they were for the next 4 years. What country did Rhodesia become? What country in Africa exported the most bodies? How many enslaved people lived in Dominica at the time of emancipation in 1833? 393, 2,902, 14,175, 104,000, 3,011. Correct answer, 14,175. Is this the evening that I am infected? Was I struck by tropical light while sitting indoors drinking tepid Coca-Cola? Did I contract archive fever from the moist breath of expats? Could archive fever contracted from drunken whites be more contagious than Delta or Omicron? Is archive fever exacerbated by tropical light? Both cause night sweats, cloudy vision, clamminess, crankiness, coughs, and floaters. The gay Teletubby is a snap. It's Tinky Winky. They carry a red handbag. I have a Tinky Winky I use as a shampoo bottle snagged by my wife at a marketing conference. I will spend years worrying about the answer to the question about slaves. A hollow plastic toy carrying a red handbag does not exist in the same universe as 14,175 bits of property, except that it does. So do Anansi the Spider-Man stealing ripe mango and Peter Rabbit pinching lettuce. Why so slow to see? Why did I let myself be soothed? Why such ignorance about the blood fertilizing the ground upon which I stand? Madness lies in digging a ditch between queer and color. And then another friend, I just want to throw this in. The book is dedicated to the runaways then and now, and also to Kim. By runaways, runaways wasn't simply an individual act. You couldn't just run away by yourself. You had to have a community. Of course, there were relations between people who were still enslaved and people who ran away and formed their own communities. Goods were traded back and forth. And this in response to the, well, earlier, but especially in the introduction of slavery at the end of the 18th, at the beginning of the 19th century, this was a global phenomenon, this resistance. In Asia and in Africa, in the United States, and what is now Canada, and what is South America. And it was a collective act, and it was an act, and we were talking about this, I think, before the whole thing started. It was an act of forming small, local, hidden communities, or communities hidden except to those in the know. So just to make it clear, the introduction is not praising people who run off for quote unquote tropical vacation. The introduction is acknowledging and trying to praise, perhaps not clearly enough, the fact of local and powerful resistances, of which there were in every Caribbean island, and several in Dominica. People who escaped the plantations, kept up their system of relations, and preserved a community for decades, for more than half a century.
I mean, there's that self-critical self-chastisement again, but I also think that the gesture of the dedication to the runaway is also its own demonstration of your commitment to addressing us as if we know, and if we don't know, we should know what runaway means. We should know what maroon means. We should know how to form networks of solidarity. We should be committed to a praxis of freedom. And if we're not, maybe this, in a way, isn't addressed to us, or we should become one of the people to whom it is addressed. I mean, it feels like, again, you're performing a key aspect of what you're talking about in that dedication.
Yeah, I think it's just important to me. I mean, insofar as I have any aesthetic principles, one of them is that it's a whole lot better to do it than to talk about it.
Well, I would love to talk about another aspect of the doing, which is this commitment to paper and the book as object. And we've got a fabulous example here on the screen right now, but we can keep going. I really would love us to talk about how this book is at once an ode to paper, feverish, pathological love of paper, an exquisite book bound in deep velvety blue, paper pages tipped in pink, and not just any pink, but a hot vibrating pink, festooned with page markers, two satin ribbons, one in red and one also in hot pink. In my copy, these were actually located at the place marked Hope. I wanted to give that meaning, even if that was random. And it's also an indictment of paper, as you put it so succinctly under the entry of mixomycetes, or what are commonly called true slime molds, on page 260 to 261, no paper, no colonialism. And under deflocculation, another word for breakdown, in this case being reduced to a state of dispersed particles, you quote yourself from another marvelous essay that those of you joining us, if you haven't yet read, please read. And if you have already read, read again, Ink on Paper again, where you talk about your mad love of paper, impossible archives, your commitment to a certain degree of impossibility, and how this is a queer love to find in labels for rot, for example, possibility, and also a kind of dedication to frictional proximity. Again, a long setup to ask if you might speak to your approach to paper and the book as material object.
Well, and we've talked about this a little bit before, Jill. I mean, one of the things that has fascinated me about books, old books, is the way that that so much of them comes from animate objects. I mean, the idea of parchment, of them being somebody's skin, of being bound in leather, of being the pages being preserved together by some sort of thread made out of plant fiber or animal gut. The fact that we refer to books as having a spine. I mean, books seem to me to have I guess, a shelf life in a way that isn't what we normally mean by shelf life. They're taken from the earth and they return to the earth. And I mean, unless you happen to be a Dead Sea Scroll, I don't see how you're going to stick around, certainly not in a rainforest. You need a nice dark cave and an absolute lack of humidity, and then you got a chance. And even then, people might not be able to read you. Yeah, so I sort of think of paper as something that, I don't know, it almost thinks too much of itself and its own immortality. But it will disintegrate. I mean, the minerals that are ground into the surface of a page won't stay there. So I don't know, I guess the question would be like, why on earth do I love that? But I do, I like looking at rot. I mean, I like looking at things disintegrate. One of the things I've always, I mean, okay, so this is personal. I had this shrink when I moved to New York who told me that I had had a deprived childhood, which shocked me. I mean, I can see how an American would say I had a deprived childhood. But in so many ways, I did not have a deprived childhood. I mean, I just didn't. So that's absurd to say that. And also, one of the things that I have always loved about forests, and rainforests in particular, is the way that underneath what appears to be the surface, there are just layers and layers and layers and layers of rot that then reveal the veins of things. I mean, the veins of leaves, the veins in bark, the veins of insects in different colors and formulations. I mean, there you go. I don't know if I have more to say about that. It's just simply, it's just one of those things. I will say, though, that in terms of the fuzzy blue cover and the ribbons and so forth, that when Jeff Kaplan, who's one of the founders of No Place Press and an incredibly brilliant designer with whom I spent more hours than I can count at the basement of 36 Orchard Street, staring at a large computer screen and moving things around. I mean, I had sort of come into this with the idea that the book in the end would be something that looked like a parody of anthropological proceedings or scientific proceedings or, you know, Smithsonian hoo-ha. It'd be like greeny brown and there'd be a black tipped in thing with the title and it would have gold letters. But Jeff is a really good shopper. And so he would just write the printer in China and ask them for samples of whatever, you know, ribbons or covers or whatever, paper stock, inks, you know, and get 18 catalogs. So he wrote up and asked for a fuzzy brown cover. And so we got a fuzzy brown cover sample, but next to it was a fuzzy blue cover sample. And both of us looked at it and went, there is no book with a fuzzy blue cover. Nobody has written a book about taking issue with colonialism that has a fuzzy blue cover. Nothing looks like this, so we're just going to use this. And then that changed everything about, you know, in some ways, I guess the apparent seriousness of the book. You know, it was like a clue from the get-go that something is not going to be exactly what you expect about this book. And then the lavishness of the edge tinting and the ribbons, which were kind of minor expenses in the end, but just like, why not? Why not use hot pink that looks so much like sunburn on white skin, you know, 3rd-degree burns on white skin?
Well, I love that insistence that the book is a living, dying skin. And also, as we were talking, spine, that, you know, there's also a violence in, you know, cracking the spine of a book that you're willing to reckon with at the same time that you may soften the blow with the velvety texture of the covers. Yeah. I think we're supposed to be moving to Q&A, but I was really hoping that we could do one last question, which is that I'd love for us to, before we turn things over, talk about how you're using photography, particularly your use of the extreme close-up that I think relates to, and you use it in a way that relates to your interest in decay. So I'm also interested in connecting that to your interest in the photo that evanesces or that got away, also the photo that you may describe or imply but won't show, about ultimately how you work with and not against the material limits of the photographic apparatus and its in-baked logics, not at all made for the Caribbean, you know, and yet, you know, the Caribbean, while we've talked already a little bit about how its climate and, you know, the climatological conditions are entirely inimical to photography as it's been developed. And yet, of course, the Caribbean is at the center of global racial capitalism. And so what happens to photography when it's also relocated to the Caribbean feels like a really key way of doing this, not just critique, but transformation, even alchemical transformation. I mean, Rot does many things, but Rot also, you know, transforms. you mentioned what happened to your copy stand, when you took it to Dominica, but, I'd love to talk a little bit about what happens with, we had discussed this, and I think it's not part of the something that we've talked about here in the Zoom, which is the particular limit on the range that you could get in copying things. So what the limit on what was accessible in the viewfinder again becomes a creative constraint for you, a constraint that becomes generative.
Well, it was, I brought to Dominica once when you could still check a big suitcase on a plane without paying them $500. I brought a cheap copy stand, which meant that it was kind of wobbly and quite short. And I was working in what was then called the Documentation Center, which is a very modest place with 2 or 3 tables. And I didn't want to just hog space, so I couldn't turn the copy stand around to get full shots. I had to work with the height limits of the piece of pipe on the coffee stand that held the camera. And so the better thing to do seemed to be to go close. Like the less intrusive and less peculiar thing to do seemed to go close. And it was also a way of making me look at those horrible inventories of planter property that were being compiled in order to create a financial instrument that would allow the British government to buy off the planters, not to give reparations to the people who've been enslaved, but to buy off the planters, a debt that was only settled about 5 years ago. In other words,
exactly,
those living long after the supposed end of slavery were paying for it. Anyway, it was also a
how
way
to
of getting,
underdevelop, right, structurally.
yeah, it was also a way of like sort of finding a way to look at the glitches and the DNA on the pages of the documents, including those inventories in the Dominica archives, to sort of look at the hands, traces, DNA of the bureaucrats who were recording this property methodically every 3 years in these giant disintegrating ledgers. Yeah, so I guess that's another way of using the constraint. And also, I guess somehow also apropos of colonialism, to get that close to paper is to realize that it's animate, and to realize that no matter what you do, it's going to look like skin. Which was fine with me, that it looked like skin, because that just seemed useful to make that point.
Well, and then in addition to the extreme close-up, right, which I think is fascinating, there's also the way that you don't give us what we expect to see often. So, on page 75 under Bermuda cedar, you write, having proposed to investigate botanical colonialism, a phrase I claim to have invented, by which I mean the movement of plants, occasionally ornamental, in the global plantation system of cash crops. And this is where our work converges, though we were on parallel tracks. I'm offered a modest grant to the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew, thus gaining access to the collections of the Museum of Economic Botany, a specialized institution which stores objects made of plant materials culled from various corners of the British Empire. In the summer of 2001, I spent 5 days a week for 6 weeks, alone, shivering in a climate-controlled basement, photographing everything from Dominica that landed at Kew. And yet, importantly, it's not that documentation that dominates. It's even displaced here, for example, by the forensic and symptomatic emblem of the effects of colonial appetite. I mean, you read it hard in this very exciting way. This wheeled chair that becomes the emblem of the gout-ridden omnivore Joseph Banks, whose collection this is. So I'm wondering if you might also address how, for a book titled After a Eugenics Tract, about the effect of tropical light on white men, this is a book that's also dedicated to a constellation of women. So there's a way that, you know, some of these patriarchs, to return to the original part of the conversation, are wheeled off. And we also get this constellation of women in and around your life, especially your mother as she's dying. You end with a postmortem photograph that you describe, but you withhold. And it was hard not to think about this book then as a version of your, to invoke Roland Barthes' camera lucida, that photograph of what's been called the winter garden photograph, because it's located in a greenhouse in France, used to grow the very plants that were part of this system of colonial botany. These, you know, tropical plants, for example, that would never grow in France except inside a greenhouse. But you know, that photograph is invoked but withheld. We don't get to see it in camera lucida. And I don't want to overdetermine, but I was also really taken by the way that you end the book, and the photographs that we, in a way, get to share with you maybe more intimately, because we see them differently. They're invoked rather than reproduced.
Was there a question in there? Or an instruction or a request, or I wasn't think I wasn't
it was an interest in maybe, yes.
I think when I was writing the bit about my mother dying, I mean, you know, I knew that winter garden essay. I think I must just have felt like Barth. There's a difference between finding yourself in exactly the same situation and referring to him. You know? Like you just can't bear to expose that photograph. I can't.
I mean, that's beautifully put. I also feel like that characterizes much of what you've done with the book, that these are not just quotes or citations. This is a living book about experiences that others have touched on, but that you figure out a way to, yeah, make touchable, palpable, even bearable, even the bearable and bearable differently, maybe.
It's just really important to me to be, as far as I can absorb it, to be aware of historical and theoretical writing. But I feel uncomfortable when I read it. I feel uncomfortable when I read those sentences, and I don't want to reproduce them. It's like I don't want to be a novelist. I mean, I don't have the capacity to be a novelist, and I don't really have the capacity to be a historian or a theorist. I want to occupy this space. It goes back to this space, the insider, outsider, in between things that Lorraine and I have talked about a lot, of using that position, that Koch position, that you can't go left and you can't go right, you can't go up, you can't go down, you can't go back, you can't go forward, as a sort of precarious place from which to do something. It's like being trying to be, as far as you can, out on the very end of a limb. And like without a net or without a tightrope, and certainly without a saw, just to see, just to see what you can make of it, you know? And for me, it's also connected with this idea of translation, which has always fascinated me, the ability to move from one culture, one language, one whatever, to one house to another, one accent to another. And that the fact of moving and of making the attempt produces a need to explain what can't be translated. It produces its own excess out of failure. Like, you know, à la recherche du temps perdu is not well translated in English, let's say, but if you want to talk about it, you have to go into great length, and that just kill the whole idea. So, but I hate that place and I love that place.
Well, let's keep as a bubble this. Let's not kill the idea in opening this up to some Q&A. We've been asked to open this up, and I want to thank you so much for the generosity of your responses to those prompts, Catherine.
It's been fun, and or fun, I think. And also, I'd like to thank the people at the Brooklyn Rail for inventing this kind of crazy circumstance in which people can talk and listen to each other. It's really brilliant.
Wow. Thank you so, so much, Jill and Catherine. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen to your dialogue today. And we have a couple of questions from the audience, but I really encourage anyone who has a question to post it in the chat, and I will be sure to pass the virtual mic to you when it's time. The first question is going to be from GE. GE, go ahead.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Jill, and thank you, Catherine. Catherine, is your aim not so much to rewrite history as to incite the past, as maybe a way of conjuring into being your being, our whole sense of the imaginary, and then to coax some kind of transfiguration in us?
Well, I've never really thought of myself as somebody who's temperamentally inclined to write history. And I feel sort of kind of incapable of writing novels, partly because although I really love your good 19th century novel, you know, I have a dog named George Eliot, for example. You know, I do want to incite something. I feel that I want to turn things that my writing might arouse, like dismay or empathy or outrage or pity. I want to unsettle all that, because I think that you know, that's a sort of state of uncertainty that we're mostly in. And certainly now we're mostly in. Okay, I'm feeling a bit too guru here. How about another question?
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
G. Thank you so much for that question. Earlier, Liz did ask when the launch party for the book is. Has there been a launch party for the book, Catherine?
There was a launch party for the book in New York. And it was a fine, rather drunken party. And many people were there, and that was lovely. Some of them are on the screen as I'm looking at them. I'm going to LA next week for another party event, which is on the 27th at a place called 2220. And that's also important to me. And then in Dominica, I'm still trying to figure out, because I have some health issues, like when to go to Dominica and how to have a launch party in Dominica. But I think that really is the most important one to me.
Thank you, Catherine.
I can let everybody know when the launch party in Dominica is.
Yeah, we can share a link to it as well when it's
That would be
Please,
great.
please do. And also, in a way, the contribution to the show in New Paltz is also adjacent to the book.
Yeah, that was because the very smart curator, Sophie Landress, kind of, I think, reading between the lines, had to do a show of Hudson Valley artists. And she basically figured out a way to do a show of Hudson Valley artists who read books. And so and it's a good show. And she asked me about it. And at that point, all sorts of stuff was happening. And so I was just like, well, we'll just figure out some way to do it. So they're like plinths and stacks of books and bits of Dominica artifacts sitting on plinths, and the Teletubby is featured spotlit so that it casts a vast shadow on the wall. And it was it's like this conversation formally. I mean, it's hard to talk about a book in public. Books aren't exactly a public thing, you hold them in your hand and you read them. And in general, one or maybe two or three people can read them at the same time. So there's this kind of tension or friction or impossibility about saying, make a set of objects that's somehow about a book when a book is already a private object. I don't know. I just found that interesting formally.
Thank you.
But I feel like we should have another New York event to share the unshareable. To share out. Yes, I really think we should.
Parties everywhere.
Yeah.
We'll share a link to with everyone to the upcoming events for the book. I have a question from.
Yes, and there is a PS1 event planned.
Oh yeah.
Where Lisa Paravicini, who, if for those of you who don't know and who are interested in the Caribbean, founded and runs this incredible blog called Repeating Islands. Thank you, Edouard Glisson, which is a really brilliant cultural take on the Caribbean, because it covers, fashion and music and scuba diving and cultural studies and novels. And I mean, it's so good. It's such a fantastic definition of culture. Anyway, so Lisa and Lisa does know Dominica, and Lisa is probably one of the 4 or 5 people on this earth who understand that Henry Nichols was a real person, and knows more about him than I do, I think. Anyway, so we are trying to arrange on May 4th a talk at He has one in the bookstore. And I think we're almost there. Lisa can do it. I can do it. Now, the question is whether Skuta Helgason can make it happen. And Connie Butler, who I think launched that ball. Yeah, so those are all planned.
That sounds very dreamy. My fingers are crossed. May 4th.
May 4th. And I think it'll be good because I think it's really important to sort of have different Caribbean islands and nationalities to understand that these places are separate but related. And you know, deeply scarred, of course, by colonialism.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for that question, Liz. The next question is from Eleanor. Eleanor, I'll give you the mic.
Thanks, Chloe. Thank you so much, Catherine and Jill. This conversation has been so brilliant. I have so many notes and things I want to keep thinking about. And Catherine, my question is about, so your work this project is obviously very rooted in place. And you also spoke about how books can be kind of very private. And I'm curious about how your work or this project has been received in the different communities that you're a part of, be that geographical communities or otherwise. I'm also I know you're also a teacher, and I'm thinking about maybe teaching as a part of your process as well. Yeah, so those are a few different ideas, but maybe if there's anything that speaks to you or that you'd like to respond to, I'd love to hear.
Well, you know, it's hard writing stuff. It's hard making stuff because you do it, you put it out there. People buy it or they don't buy it, or they say, I don't get it, or, oh my God, this is boring, or why did you do that? Or, oh, it's beautiful, you know, that kind of stuff. But in the end, I think, I feel like you're really only making something for one or two people. You know, sometimes I just fall down on the idea of community and what that could possibly be. For all the obvious reasons. It's I think that one of the closest things for me is making something with someone else. I mean, the process of collaborating, or being allowed space in someone's project, or giving someone space in my project. It's like it's getting under the skin business. You know, you really understand the stakes, and you're just invested in a way, and that's the best. It's better than selling 3 million copies of something. Although, you know, that would be nice financially, but it ain't going to happen.
Thank you
Well,
for that.
and you invited 3 collaborators into your project in very explicit ways. So 3
Yeah.
Friends, all extraordinary writers, thinkers, artists in
Yeah.
their own right. I don't
Well,
know if you wanted to say anything about that.
I asked Ann Walsh, who I met long ago when she was a student at CalArts, and with whom I've stayed friends. And it's not so easy to be friends with your ex-students. I mean, it's like trying to be friends with your ex-analyst. You know, something really has to shift to make that possible. And so rather than producing a biography, I asked Anne to write something biographical. So she did. Celia Sorhendo is a fantastic kind of trans UK Caribbean, deep roots in Dominica, incredible voice, incredible writer, kind of game for everything. And I wanted to give her space. We don't know each other that well, but there are things I believe that we both like cadence and voice and disjunction that are really important to us. And Carolyn Dinshaw is a fantastic big thinker, very much involved in queer medieval studies. And is also bicultural, Indian American. And so I was interested in the idea of kind of going back to the medieval and the monument and the discomfort about being neither nor, really. So yeah, those were kind of strategic.
Well, and work really beautifully and are interspersed in, as with everything in terms of the construction of the book, surprising places. And I wonder if we have, I think, a few minutes. I'd love to close with your giving us a last reading, Catherine. I was especially hoping for Zami, if you're willing.
Okay. Zami. I have to find it.
382 to 383.
Got it. Okay, Zami is most definitely not Henry Nichols's heading. And Henry Nichols would probably put Zamis to death, or maybe not. Anyway, okay, so Zami, blasts like volcanoes happen in series. St. Vincent blew up in April 2021, covering that island with ash and imperiling its water supply. Dominica offered to relocate refugees to one of its unfinished hotels, but St. Vincent residents chose to tough it out. My retired lawyer friend Janet, with whom I play words with friends and discuss trash pulp finds about Dominica, tips me off to a memoir written by a boy who lived down the road, one of two brothers I remember as large, blonde, feral American adolescents. I buy the book, why not? A Kindle bargain at $2.99. The boy has rendered my father as Mr. Ford, a figure of fun and a comic linchpin so plastered that though he regularly pissed himself, he nonetheless managed a weekly fuck on Friday afternoons with a woman who lived further down the hill. Batwoman, the brothers called her, because she had lanky black hair. I had no idea that was your father, Janet texts. That's so sad, I'm sorry. When I called Peter, now a successful real estate agent in Marin County, I imagine that he feels slightly embarrassed. His portrait of my father is nasty. His picture of his father is adulatory. I am aware that my father was a drunk, I say. But who was Batwoman? Peter goes vague. Maybe it wasn't every Friday, he concedes. Maybe it was Lennox's mother, I suggest. He dismisses the suggestion. I volunteer Robbie, the wife of my father's business partner. No. I always wondered what happened to you two girls, he muses. Peter is on his way to Mexico to work on a script for a television series based on his memoir. I know people in Hollywood, he explains. They say that I really should. Anyway, I'm sure that Batwoman lived at Antrim because the driveway went down from the road. Peter is hardly a reliable narrator, Janet observes, in an effort to comfort me. Why would Peter lie? My sister asks. Lennox and I discuss Batwoman on his veranda. The day, as it happens, after my mother died of COVID, after I had finally made it to Dominica. I wasn't with her. I couldn't navigate the bureaucracy in time to return. Besides, he adds, I think we lived at Antrim then. Maybe it was the woman who rented the little house up the road at Springfield. In the photograph which I made my sister take, my mother lies on her right side, her mouth in the rictus of death. Her false teeth have been removed, causing her cheeks to sink and her cheekbones to become more prominent. Her body must still have been slightly warm, but the blood has drained down and the yellow of death is beginning under her skin. I know from Natalie's body that my mother's nails will now be tingeing green. Her hair is uncombed, allowing a few white curls to escape at the back of her neck. They make her at once implausibly girlish and extremely dead. My sister refuses to look at the photograph again. I cannot help myself. There's no one left who could come to a memorial service. We grieve by composing her obituary and paying to have it printed in the Burlington, Iowa Hawkeye and the Orlando Sentinel. Margaret Betty Lord, 97, died from an advanced age with COVID-19 as a contributing factor. On April 14th, 2021, she was a resident of the Mayflower Retirement Community Health Center in Winter Park, Florida. She was born in Bridgetown, Barbados, to Beryl and Reginald Johnson in 1923. Her father was a manager of various Caribbean branches of the Royal Bank of Canada. Betty was a graduate of Codrington High School, Barbados, where she was head girl. Her plans to attend university in England were stifled by the Second World War, as it was too dangerous to cross the Atlantic by boat. During the course of her long life, she lived in Montserrat, British Guiana, Grenada, and Dominica, Burlington, Iowa, and Maitland, Florida. She married Robert Owen Lord Jr. of Evanston, Illinois, and Dominica in 1948. Was widowed in 1969 and lost her only son, Robert Owen Lord III, in a car accident in 1970. She worked for many years as a teller at the Farmers and Merchants Bank and Trust in Burlington. Betty guarded her British accent and was always surprised when anyone instantly recognized her voice on the phone. She was possessed of a generous heart, great intelligence, practicality, and a wry wit. She loved her daughters Linda, Maitland, and Catherine, New York City, who survive her, as well as angels, roses, her garden, reading, cooking, telling stories, English china, flan, and a needlework pillow that read, Uppity Women Unite. According to her wishes, her ashes will be interred in the Starker Mausoleum at Aspen Grove Cemetery, Burlington, next to those of her husband and her son. Some months later, in July of 2021, I learn about the Guerrilla Memorial Wall on the Albert Embankment, created by those British who lost someone to COVID. 150 hearts. The wall downriver from the Museum of Garden History is directly in view of the Houses of Parliament. I ask, and Polly Patalo promises to add my mother's name. And there's a photograph of that wall, the COVID wall. And Polly Patalo I see on the screen in Dominica, which is lovely.
Catherine, that was such a beautiful way to end this program. Thank you so, so much for reading to conclude today. And thank you to Jill and to you for this dialogue, which has been such a treat to listen to this afternoon. I'd also really like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor our new social environment program and make weekday conversations like this one possible. They also support the Rails archive, where you'll be able to watch this conversation later today. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years. A donation directly supports our staff and our operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with Black and Pink Nationals Daryl Brown Jr. and Jasmine Tasaki about their work as a prison abolitionist organization dedicated to abolishing the criminal punishment system and liberating LGBTQIA2S+ people and people living with HIV/AIDS who are affected by that system. The conversation will be hosted by Rail contributor Ted Kerr. And as is Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon.
Wow,
Major
thank you, Jill.
Hey,
Thank you. Thank you,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank
you, Jill.
Good to
Thank
see
you all
everyone.
for
Thank
coming,
you.
for being there.
Thank you. Congratulations.